John Brown is a hero to many in the radical left. Considering his character, and essentially he failed, that seems kind of odd. But why is this? Well, let's get into John Brown himself a little bit. John Brown was a radical Calvinist and premillennialist. Premillennials believe that the second coming of Jesus can't occur until the world is made more perfect. John Brown's actions through his life are shaped by the idea that he needed to make the world a more biblical place. What set himself apart is that he believed certain people were designated by God to use violence. He thought he had a unique understanding of the Bible, which allowed him to assert vengeance upon evildoers by declaring certain Old Testament laws as superseding New Testament laws. He believed he personally was designated by God to destroy slavery to usher in the second coming. Our first John Brown event is Bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas starts in 1854, 6 years before the Civil War. It certainly ends up having a major impact on the course of secession and Civil War. However, the events themselves were really blown completely out of proportion by newspapers seeking to sensationalize what at the time was the most controversial subject. The compromise era of American politics looked toward keeping the Senate evenly split between slave and free states to maintain harmony. As new states were added, maintaining this even split became more and more difficult. First, due to the fact the population in the North was rapidly outgrowing the South. Second, the suitability of plantation style agricultural endeavors tapered off dramatically as one traveled further north or west. So, as new states were added, they would tend towards being free states because more settlers would come from the north than the south due to population differences and due to limited agricultural opportunities for businesses operating with slave labor. The way of American politics was to try to have one slave state enter with a corresponding free state enter to maintain Senate balance. Nebraska and Kansas were allowed to transition from territories to states under the concept of popular sovereignty. The residents would pick representatives. These representatives would draft state constitutions that either supported or prohibited slavery. It was assumed that Nebraska would surely be a free state and that Kansas would most likely become a slave state. In the case of Kansas, it became a competition with activists from both sides sending in settlers trying to tip the balance in each other's favor. There was some highly publicized violence, and 4 times they would attempt to send a constitution to Washington, D.C. for approval. During the entire 6 year period of Bleeding Kansas, a grand total of somewhere between 55 and 65 people died. The casualties were about evenly split, probably a few more on the Free State side. There were many, many incidents of two sides shooting at each other with either nothing happened or minor wounding, and there was a lot of reported property damage, most of it being inflicted against the slave state side. There were many incidents with government officials taking sides in disputes. There were allegations of vote fraud and intimidation. So, how does John Brown fit into Bleeding Kansas? Well, he showed up with his sons and his associates with no intention of settling. They were there for the sole purpose of joining in the fighting. When he arrived, there had yet to have been a fatality. People began dying after his arrival, but not by his hand. That was just literally coincidentally. Brown believed the Free State settlers were being too passive. So he decided that he and his sons and men would go handle this situation, and they pulled 5 men from their houses for being associated with the pro slavery political groups. These men owned no slaves themselves, and had not been implicated for violence or intimidation against free state settlements. They were executed in cold blood. No allegations of wrongdoing by the murdered people have ever been brought to light. Because Kansas had only two counties marginally capable of producing cotton, the state was never going to be a draw for permanent pro slave settlers. Because the northern population advantage, it was inevitable that the state would eventually have a majority of free state population. So the best scenario is that Kansas might have become a free state a little sooner than later if no Civil War had happened. The worst case for Kansas is probably more likely. Because northern newspapers and religious crazies like Brown were stirring things up, they likely caused a lot of settler families to delay coming, most of which would have been free state settlers who could have voted to alter the state constitution much earlier than it had. In other words, John Brown murdered 5 innocent men for no purpose whatsoever. John Brown's second claim to fame requires a little bit of background. Now, there were about perhaps a dozen slave uprisings that were notable in the South. And I really honestly, off the top of my head, I don't know the exact number. When I was teaching a course on this, I went over them. But so a dozen might be overstating it. But the point being is, in the instances where these slave rebellions occurred, it was excessively bloody. The slaves realized that they would likely get no quarter, they would not be allowed to surrender, so they would typically kill the entire family of their owners, men, women, and children, often sexually violating the women prior, and then they would move down the road to the next family of slave owners to repeat this. Needless to say, the very idea of slave uprisings were nightmare fuel for the southern states. John Brown's next great idea? Foment a massive slave uprising that would sweep the South. Now, Brown knew very well what that meant in terms of the brutality that would ensue. His plan was that he and his crew raided the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. The purpose was to distribute guns to the local slave population to start a chain reaction slave uprising that he hoped would spread to all slaveholding regions of the U.S. In the end, it turned out he lacked the planning to get beyond seizing the arsenal. He and his men were trapped there, captured after a firefight, and eventually tried and hung. Ultimately, this event would result in radical northern newspaper editorials praising John Brown and openly acknowledging support for slave insurrections that would result in vast swaths of southern families being killed. And when I say that, I don't mean infer. These editorials literally said the only way this is getting solved is by slave owners getting killed. So these editorials would end up doing the most to cause the South to overreact to the election of Lincoln, who, for all intents and purposes, was a moderate on slavery. So let's start breaking this down. John Brown attempted to trigger a slave revolt, but he failed miserably. So what if he had succeeded? Let's say somehow the chain reaction of slave revolts begins spreading across the U.S. like he envisioned. What do you suppose would have happened? Would the state governments and federal government just sit back and watch? No, they would have launched a massive military operation. Once word got out about the brutality going on in terms of how the slaves were killing families as they went, the backlash probably would have been huge. A lot of northern normies would have probably been saying, hey, maybe we don't want to free the slaves. At a minimum, black people would have died in huge numbers had his rebellion idea worked. Likely, many slave owners would have opted to execute slaves that they were thought going to be future troublemakers as a preventative. It's possible, if things had gone far enough, that this might have triggered something akin to a genocide with mass killings and deportations. Also, it could have made a case for not ending slavery, saying, no, we're not ready for this. The abolitionist movement likely would have been set back for generations. So, in other words, this was a really bad plan. But well, didn't it kind of all work out for the good because the Civil War ended slavery? Isn't that right? Well, again, that's kind of questionable. John Brown's actions certainly inflamed things, but let's assume for a moment that he never became active. Northern media would have continued to sensationalize all things dealing with slavery. There was a fixation on it in certain segments of the population up there. In fact, the more salacious the stories, the more they liked him. In fact, people writing slave accounts and like Tom Brown, excuse me, Uncle Tom's Cabin, uh, although highly fictional, were beloved by people and assumed to be highly accurate depictions of what were going on. So even without John Brown, it's likely editorials for slave revolts and the death of slave owners being called for would still have occurred, just not without a catalyzing event around them. This in itself may have caused the Civil War to occur on schedule. So let's take it a different direction. Again, let's assume that John Brown's incidents never occurred. It might have actually delayed the inevitable, maybe the Civil War comes later, or delayed things long enough to avert the Civil War crisis. Now, in actuality, both of these would have been a good thing because slavery ended everywhere else on the planet except for here in Haiti without violence. Uh, and this is kind of going longer than I planned. And I was going to talk a little bit about the idea of like alt historying the US without a civil war, but this is going to chew up a lot of time. So I think I'll just do a whole nother video on this. So to sum up, John Brown was a religious extremist who believed he was God's instrument of vengeance. There's a chance he was crazy. He murdered 5 people in Kansas for no transgressions or crime, and it actually did really little to alter the situation there. He just became a folk hero to the northern newspapers. He launched a botched raid on Harper's Ferry, and if his raid had been successful, if things had happened the way he wanted to, he may have ended up wiping out all the black people in America. So any success he had was contributing to triggering a civil war that may or may not have happened without him. So why does the extreme left love him? Well, he's seen as a man of action. He's a person following his convictions and causing a world-changing event. But as we discussed in this video and others, this is the direction things were already going. Now, let's say you're an anarchist. You should really look at your history. All revolutions and civil wars lead to a consolidation of power, with maybe a minor exception for about maybe 18 months in Ukraine between the end of World War I and the beginning of the Russian Civil War. Now, if you're a socialist, you have to consider that not all power consolidations are beneficial to your cause. Look at history, it's a coin toss. So, if you want to emulate John Brown, read your Bible, make some stuff up to justify being violent, go commit random acts of violence, hoping you'll change the world. I had some other things to say, but maybe I'm just going to leave that where it is. So, comments below. What do you think? John Brown, did he actually change the course of events, or was he just basically swept along in the stream with those events? Did he change history? Did he speed things up? Were the things only going to happen anyway? And how about for you, John Brown, hero or villain? Tell me what you think. All right, please smash the like button. If you do not get my videos, check out my titles. I get into a lot of different things. It's worth a subscription. And also, if you know someone who might find this interesting, please share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.